She slapped me so hard in that hospital hallway that I tasted blood at the back of my teeth, and the worst part was that I still didn't understand what I had done wrong. Her mother, a woman who had baked me birthday cake since I was 7 years old, stood there shaking, her hands still raised, her eyes red and swollen, screaming that I had killed her daughter. But her daughter wasn't dead. She was behind a curtain 20 feet away, alive, breathing, hooked up to machines. And I was the one being blamed for all of it. Let me go back. Let me take you all the way back, because none of this makes sense unless you understand where it started. Her name was Elena. I'm not going to use her real name, or mine, or anyone's, because some of these people I still love, and some of them I'm not sure I'll ever speak to again, and I don't think it's fair to put their names out there for the world to pick apart. So call me whatever you want. Call her Elena. That's close enough. Elena and I didn't meet the way most couples meet. There was no first glance across a crowded room, no awkward first date, no slow discovery of each other. We had always existed in each other's lives, like two trees that grew up in the same yard and eventually leaned into one another. Our fathers had been roommates in college, best friends, the kind of friends who stand at each other's weddings and name children after one another. When they both settled down, they made a deliberate choice to buy houses in the same neighborhood, for doors apart, on a quiet street lined with old maples that turned the color of fire every October. So Elena and I grew up together. We learned to ride bikes on the same cracked stretch of sidewalk. We had matching scars on our knees from the same fall down the same hill. On weekends, our families ate dinner together so often that I had my own chair at her kitchen table, and she had hers at mine. Our mothers used to joke, half seriously, that they were going to be in-laws one day. I remember being 11 and gagging at the idea. I remember being 16 and not gagging anymore. I was the one who finally asked her out. We were both 15, sitting on the roof of her garage the way we always did on summer nights, watching the heat lightning flicker on the horizon, and I just said it. I said, "I think I've been in love with you my whole life, and I don't know what to do about it." And she laughed, not a cruel laugh, a nervous, happy, disbelieving laugh. And she grabbed my hand and said, "You absolute idiot. I've been waiting since the 8th grade." That was it. That was the beginning. And for a long time, it was perfect. Genuinely, stupidly perfect. The kind of young love that you don't appreciate while you're inside of it, because you assume the whole world feels this way. After we graduated high school, we took a gap year together before university. We pooled the money we'd both saved from years of summer jobs, and we traveled. We backpacked through cheap hostels and slept on overnight trains and split single meals when our budget got thin. We watched the sun come up over mountains neither of us could pronounce the names of. There's a photo of the two of us on a ferry, wind whipping her hair into my face, both of us laughing so hard we're crying, and I genuinely believed in that moment that I was looking at the woman I was going to marry. I believed it the way you believe in gravity. It wasn't a hope. It was a fact about the universe. When the gap year ended, reality came knocking. I got into a good university, but it was a 2-hour commute each way by train from our neighborhood. 2 hours there, 2 hours back. 4 hours a day of my life on a rattling train just to attend an 8 a.m. lecture. So I made the practical decision. I moved into student housing on campus. Elena stayed home. She'd enrolled in a local college, only a 10-minute drive from the houses we'd grown up in, and so she stayed in her childhood bedroom while I packed up mine. I want to be very clear about something, because it became important later. I did not abandon her. I did not move away and forget about her. Every single weekend that I possibly could, I came home. If I didn't have an exam to study for, if there wasn't some project breathing down my neck, I was on that train Friday evening, riding 2 hours just to spend a day and a half with her, and then riding 2 hours back Sunday night. I rearranged my entire life to keep seeing her. I told her before I ever moved that we could find another way, maybe a college that had programs we both wanted. Maybe she could transfer to a school near mine. I had looked into it. I'd actually sat down and researched options for her. And every time, she told me the same thing. She told me she'd be fine. She told me she wanted me to chase what I wanted, that she was happy where she was. That long distance for a couple of years was nothing for two people who'd already spent their whole lives together. So I believed her. Why wouldn't I? This was Elena. This was the girl who knew me better than my own mother did. This was my best friend before she was ever my girlfriend. The visits were good. They felt normal. We'd cook in her parents' kitchen, or mine, and watch old movies, and walk the same neighborhood loops we'd walked 1,000 times. She never seemed unhappy. She never gave me a single reason to think something was wrong. There were no tearful phone calls about loneliness, no fights about me being gone. If anything, our relationship felt steady, settled, like something that had already survived the hard part and was just coasting now. Which is why what happened 2 weekends ago hit me like a car coming through a red light. It was a Saturday. I'd taken the train down the night before. The moment I walked into her parents' house, I could tell something was off about her. I'd known her for nearly her entire existence. Remember, I could read her micro-expressions the way you read a clock. She had this particular kind of jittery, restless energy, the same energy she got when she was hiding a birthday present, when she was sitting on a secret she was excited to share. So, I figured it was something good. A surprise. Maybe she'd gotten into a program she'd been wanting, or she'd planned some little trip for us. We sat on the edge of her bed. She kept opening her mouth and closing it again. She fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. Finally, after maybe 20 minutes of dancing around it, she took this deep, shaky breath, looked at me, and said the words that detonated my entire world. She asked if I would be open to opening up our relationship. I just sat there. For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. I asked her to say it again, and she did, and she started explaining, saying she loved me, that this wasn't about not loving me, that she'd just been thinking about it, about being young, about exploring, about living life before we settled into something forever. And the whole time she's talking, I'm hearing a roaring sound in my ears because the girl I thought I was going to marry was sitting on the bed where we used to do homework as teenagers, calmly asking my permission to sleep with other men. For me, intimacy is not something you negotiate. It's not a buffet. When I committed to her, I committed everything. The idea of her with someone else, the idea of being asked to just be okay with it, felt like she'd reached into my chest and pulled something out by the root. I should have stayed calm. I know that now. I've replayed this moment 1,000 times, and in every single replay, I am a better person than I actually was. But in the real version, the one that actually happened, I asked her a question. I asked her, very quietly, if she had anyone specific in mind, and she went still. Her face changed, and she admitted, nervous, almost whispering, that yes, there was a guy. There was already a guy. That's when something in me broke open. Because it was one thing to ask a hypothetical question about freedom and youth and exploring. It was another thing entirely to learn that while I was riding 4 hours of trains every weekend to be with her, while I was studying my way through a degree so I could one day build us a life, she had been looking at someone else. Long enough to have a name. Long enough to have a face in her mind. I lost my temper. I didn't scream. I want to be honest. I didn't scream, but I shouted. I stood up and I shouted at her. I called her unfaithful. I said some other things too, things I'm not going to repeat because they make me sound like exactly the kind of person I never wanted to be. The words just came pouring out of me, hot and ugly, years of certainty curdling into rage in the span of about 90 seconds. She started crying immediately. Not delicate movie star crying, real, ugly, gasping crying. She kept saying she was sorry, that she should never have brought it up, that she'd ruined everything, that she would take it all back if she could. And as I grabbed my jacket off the back of her desk chair, she grabbed my arm and begged me, not to leave angry. She said, please, let's just talk about it. Please don't walk out the door like this. I walked out the door like that. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look back. I just left her there, sobbing on the bed, and I walked out into the cold and I went to the train station. And here's a small, miserable detail that I keep getting stuck on. It was nighttime, and at night they run fewer trains, so my usual 2-hour ride home turned into a 4-hour ordeal. For hours in a half-empty, rattling train car, replaying the conversation, my anger refusing to cool, just feeding on itself, getting bigger and harder and meaner the longer I sat with it. What would you have done in that situation? Honestly, sitting on that train, would you have texted her back? Would you have gotten off at the next stop and turned around? Let me know in the comments. I genuinely want to know because I've never been able to decide if there was a right answer. By the next morning, the story had spread. I'm guessing Elena's mom called my mom because my mother started calling me, and by then my anger was still at its absolute peak, white hot, and I'm ashamed of how I handled it. When my mom got me on the phone, I called Elena some genuinely nasty names. I called her unfaithful again to my own mother, like I was building a legal case. And my mom, who has known and loved Elena since the day she was born, she flipped out on me. She started yelling, telling me I had no right to talk about that girl that way, that I'd left her in a terrible state, that I was being cruel. So I hung up on my mother. I just ended the call. I was 20 years old and convinced I was the only person in the entire world who understood what fair and unfair even meant. That was the beginning of the siege, because from that day forward, my mom called me every single day. She texted me constantly. Long messages, short messages, voice notes. Telling me I needed to talk to Elena. Telling me I was making a mistake. Telling me I should hear her out. And every message just made me angrier, because to me it felt like everyone had decided that I was the villain in a story where I was so obviously the one who'd been wronged. The breaking point, the thing that actually cracked my certainty for the first time, was my dad. You have to understand my father to understand why this mattered. My dad is not a man who involves himself in emotional drama. He's quiet. He's steady. In 20 years, I could probably count on one hand the number of times he'd inserted himself into my personal life. He's the kind of man who fixes the leaky faucet and pays the bills and shows his love through actions, not conversations. He does not call you up to talk about your feelings. And he called me up to talk about my feelings. He told me, in his low, measured voice, that I should at least hear her out, that I owed her a conversation, if nothing else, after all those years. And then he said something that lodged in my chest like a splinter. He said that he'd heard she wasn't eating, that she'd been skipping her classes, that she wasn't doing well. My first instinct was to dismiss it. I told myself it was guilt trip garbage, that her parents had probably fed that detail to my parents specifically to soften me up, to manipulate me into coming back. That's what I told myself, because the alternative, that she was genuinely falling apart, was something I wasn't ready to hold. But it was my dad. That was the thing I couldn't get around. If it had been my mom telling me she wasn't eating, I'd have rolled my eyes. But my dad doesn't do drama. My dad doesn't manipulate. My dad had never once in my life called me to plead someone else's case. And here he was doing exactly that. It rattled me in a way nothing else had. For the first time since I'd walked out of her bedroom, a tiny crack appeared in my certainty, and through that crack came a single terrifying question. What if I was wrong about some of this? I didn't know what to do. I was so conflicted I felt physically sick. Part of me wanted to listen to my dad, to sit down with Elena and let her explain herself. And part of me, the loud, wounded, furious part, was screaming that talking to her would only drag me back into the very thing I'd worked up the courage to escape. That hearing her explanations would just confuse me, soften me, trick me into accepting something I knew in my bones I could never accept. So I did what people do when they're drowning in their own thoughts. I reached out for advice. I told my story to strangers, hoping someone would hand me the right answer like a life preserver. And the strangers were divided. Some of them told me to stand my ground, that asking to open up a relationship is just a polite way of asking permission to cheat with a safety net, that I deserve someone who only wanted me. Others told me I was being too harsh, that asking a question isn't a crime, that it probably took her enormous courage to even bring it up, that I should end things kindly instead of cruelly, that I shouldn't have called her names just for being honest about what she was feeling. I fought with all of them. That's the embarrassing truth. Every person who tried to nuance the situation, I argued with. I clung to that one detail like a drowning man clings to a rock. She already had a guy in mind. Not a hypothetical. A specific person, which meant in my mind that she'd been looking, fantasizing, drifting towards someone else, all while I was breaking my back to stay close to her. How could I know what she had or hadn't already done with him? How could I ever trust her again? I never once imagined myself with anyone else. Not once in all those years. So why was that so impossible for her? If you're still with me in this story, if any of this is hitting close to home for you, hit that subscribe button. We post new stories like this one every single day. Because what happened next is the part one still can't fully look at, even now. For 4 days, I tried to bury myself in distraction. I was in the middle of an internship, a real one, the kind that could turn into a career if I didn't screw it up, and I threw myself a project there, trying to drown the noise in my head with work. I think I made things worse. I think I botched the project, honestly, because my hands were doing one thing while my mind was 1,000 miles away on a quiet street with old maple trees, replaying her face when she begged me not to leave. And then my dad did something I hadn't expected. After I'd finally told him my full side of the story, every detail, the open relationship, the guy she had in mind, all of it, he went quiet for a few hours. And then he called me back. And what he told me changed the entire shape of the disaster. He told me he hadn't known any of it. He hadn't known about the open relationship, hadn't known there was another guy, hadn't known the real reason I'd stormed out. And here's the part that made my stomach drop. Neither had my uncle, his best friend, Elena's father. Neither had her dad. The only two people in either family who'd actually known the truth of what happened that night were my mother and Elena's mother. The two of them had been managing the entire situation between them, deciding who got told what, keeping the fathers in the dark, controlling the whole narrative. When I told my dad everything, he was furious. Not at me. At the situation, at being kept in the dark, at the fact that 2 marriages worth of trust had been quietly bypassed. And about 2 hours after that conversation, my mom called me, crying. She accused me of ruining everything. She said my dad had screamed at her, and my dad does not scream over being lied to. She said my uncle was upset too, at having been left out. She asked me if I was happy now, if I was happy that I'd potentially blown up 2 long, loving marriages over what she called a harmless question. I hung up on her again, because what else could I do? I was already buried under more mental weight than I could carry, and now I was being told that on top of losing the love of my life, I was also responsible for cracking the foundations of both my parents' marriage and my uncle's. I sat in my dorm room, phone hot in my hand, and I genuinely could not tell anymore whether I was the wrong party or the architect of everyone's misery. I didn't sleep much those nights. I'd lie on my narrow dorm bed, staring at the ceiling, and the same loop would run over and over. Her face when she asked, her face when she admitted there was a guy, her face when I shouted, her hand on my arm at the door. I kept trying to find the exact frame where it had all gone wrong, the single moment I could have done differently, and I couldn't find it because every choice felt forced on me by the choice before it. And then came a morning that split my life into a before and an after. I woke up to my phone buzzing relentlessly. Call after call after call from my mom. That many calls that early is never good news. Some animal part of my brain knew it before I even answered. And when I finally picked up, my mother was barely able to get the words out. Elena had tried to take her own life. She had tried to hang herself. She was in the hospital. I don't remember most of that phone call. That's the strange, awful thing. I've tried to recall it, and there are just gaps, big white blank spaces where the most important conversation of my life should be. But here's what my broken brain decided to hold on to instead. I remember the taxi cost somewhere around $800 or $900. I remember that number perfectly. I can tell you what I paid for the ride home, but I cannot tell you what my mother said when she told me the girl I'd loved my entire life had tried to die. I think there's something genuinely wrong with me, that my mind filed away the price of a taxi and threw away that. Or maybe that's just what shock does. Maybe the mind grabs the small, survivable details because the big one would crush it. I got home as fast as money could carry me. I went straight to the hospital. And the moment I walked into that hallway, Elena's mother came at me. She slapped me across the face, hard, in front of everyone. The same woman who used to slip me extra cookies when my own mom wasn't looking, the woman who'd have been my mother-in-law in another version of this life. And I, instead of standing there and taking it, instead of having an ounce of grace in the worst moment of everyone's lives, started screaming back at her. I screamed, asking why I was being blamed for all of this. Why me? Why was I the villain? What had I actually done except refuse to share the person I loved? It was an ugly scene. 2 grieving people screaming at each other in a hospital hallway while the person they were both grieving over lay alive, but broken behind a curtain. I'm not proud of it. I'm not proud of almost any of how I acted through this entire thing. But in that moment, all I could feel was this enormous, suffocating injustice, like the whole world had agreed to point at me. And no one was pointing at the question that started it. No one was angry at the fact that she'd asked, that she'd had a guy in mind, that she'd lit the fuse. Everyone was just angry that I'd been the one holding the match when it went off. The one good thing, the only good thing in all of it, was my dad. After the fight in the hospital, after I made a scene and been slapped and screamed myself hoarse, he was the one who came and got me. He put his hand on the back of my neck the way he used to when I was small, and he walked me out to the car, and he took me home. He didn't lecture me. He didn't tell me what I should have done. He just sat with me, and he opened a couple of beers, and the two of us drank in the kitchen in silence. And for the first time in days, I didn't feel completely, utterly alone. I love my dad. I want that written down somewhere permanent. Through this whole catastrophe, when my mother was managing narratives and my uncle was hurt and her parents wanted my blood, my father was the only person who simply stood beside me without conditions. I honestly don't know what I would have done without him. I think, and this is a dark thing to admit, I think if he hadn't been there, if I hadn't had even one person in my corner, I'm not sure my own thoughts wouldn't have started drifting somewhere very bad too. When I finally tried to talk about it again, when I tried to make sense of it out loud, the things people said to me were probably the right things, and I couldn't fully hear them. They told me I couldn't be blamed for my parents' marriage, that they were grown adults responsible for their own choices, and that the idea I should have stayed in a relationship that hurt me just to protect everyone else's feelings was its own kind of cruelty. They told me I couldn't be blamed for what Elena did to herself, for the same reason, that she was an adult, that breakups happen, that the alternative people seemed to want the idea that I should have stayed with her to keep her alive was just emotional blackmail dressed up as love. That no one should have to remain in a relationship under the threat of someone harming themselves if they leave. They told me her mother had no right to put hands on me, that adults shouldn't slap people, and that even an unbearable grief, it wasn't my fault, and a slap wouldn't make it mine. They told me to stay close to my dad, to stop drinking, to find a therapist, to start journaling, to do anything that might quiet the loop of thoughts running circles in my skull. They told me, gently, that I clearly was not in a good mental state and that I should get help. And the thing is, I knew they were right in the way you know something is right without being able to feel that it's right. But every logical, compassionate thing they offered me just bounced off the wall of one ugly, stubborn feeling I couldn't put down. I hated her. In that moment, sitting in the wreckage of both our families, I hated her. Why couldn't she just have been normal? Why did she have to ask that stupid question? Why couldn't she have just kept loving me the simple way she had for years, the way I'd loved her? For weeks earlier, everything in my life had been fine. Everything had been on track. And one conversation had taken all of it. My relationship, my peace, my family stability, possibly her life, and fed it into a wood chipper. When someone asked me, kindly, who I had to lean on, I snapped that I only had my dad, that no one else gave a damn about me, because if they did, why was I the one being blamed for all of it? Why wasn't anyone angry at her for asking? Why wasn't her own mother furious with her instead of slapping me? Why me? It was always why me. That was the only prayer I knew how to say in those days. And then there was the thought that I couldn't shake, the one that's followed me since, the cruelest one of all. Someone suggested, reasonably, that if Elena harmed herself, that was on her, not me, that threatening or attempting self-harm in response to a breakup is a form of emotional blackmail and not a debt the other person owes. And I heard that. I understood it. But the thought that kept circling back, the splinter I couldn't dig out, was simpler and meaner and pointed straight at myself. If I just never told my dad the full story, if I just kept my mouth shut, eaten the anger, left it all alone, then none of this would have happened. My dad wouldn't have been dragged in. My mom wouldn't have been exposed. The fathers wouldn't have been blindsided. The whole hidden, fragile arrangement my mother and Elena's mother had built to manage the fallout would never have collapsed. And maybe, Elena wouldn't have reached the place she reached. Do you think that's fair? Do you think any of this was actually my fault? Drop a comment below and tell me honestly, do you think I made the right call? Because I have asked myself that question every single hour of every single day since, and I still don't have an answer I can live with. I keep coming back to the roof of her garage. 15 years old, heat lightning on the horizon, my hand in hers, both of us so certain we were each other's whole future. I keep wondering at what exact moment that boy and that girl turned into two people screaming across a hospital hallway. There wasn't one moment. That's what I finally started to understand. It wasn't the question, and it wasn't my temper, and it wasn't the distance, and it wasn't the mothers managing their secrets. It was all of it, every small choice stacked on top of the last, until the weight came down on the people least able to hold it up. I don't know if Elena and I were ever really right for each other, or if we'd just grown up so tangled together that neither of us knew how to be a separate person. I don't know if her question came from boredom or loneliness or genuine cruelty or just the clumsy, honest fumbling of someone too young to know how to want two things at once. I'll probably never know, because I'm not sure we'll ever sit in a room together again without our family's wreckage piled up between us. Why to know is this? Anger feels like clarity when you're inside it. It feels like the one true thing in a world of lies, like the only solid ground in an earthquake. But anger is a liar. It told me that walking out of that bedroom was strength. It told me that hanging up on my mother was justice. It told me that screaming in a hospital hallway was self-defense. And every time it was wrong. And every time I believed it, because believing it was so much easier than sitting still and feeling how much I was hurting and how much I had hurt someone else. If there's anything I've taken from the worst month of my life, it's that being right is not the same as being whole. I might have been right to refuse an open relationship. I'll always believe I was. But being right didn't protect a single person I loved. It didn't keep Elena off that hospital bed. It didn't keep my parents from screaming at each other for the first time in my memory. It didn't keep me from becoming someone who could shout at a grieving mother. I won every argument I had on the way down, and at the bottom of all that winning, I found myself sitting in a kitchen drinking beer with my father because he was the last bridge I hadn't burned. I'm going to get help. I've decided that much sitting here. Not because I think I was wrong to leave, but because I can finally see that being right was never going to be enough to put me back together. There's a difference between defending yourself and destroying everything around you to prove a point. And somewhere in those 4 weeks, I lost the ability to tell them apart. I'd like to find it again before I'm too old or too hardened to bother looking. And Elena, wherever she is, whatever she's healing from, whoever she becomes after this, I hope she lives. I hope she lives a long time and gets so far away from that hospital bed and that quiet street that it becomes just a bad chapter in a long book. I hope it for her, and I hope it for the kid on the garage roof who loved her, and I hope it for the version of me that still, against all the evidence, wishes things had gone any other way than this. That's the whole story. That's everything I have. And the only thing I'm certain of, after all of it, is that I would give back every argument I ever won just to undo the one door I shouldn't have walked out of. Guys, we are so close to hit 1,000 subscribers on this channel. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing. It really helps hit that 1,000 mark. Thanks for making this dream come true.